turn on the recording now, so I don't forget to turn it on. Wow, this is great. Lots of new people. Reminded me. Yeah, this actually has been the one upside of COVID, is that we moving our seminars online. Let's see, here we go. We just have so many more participants from all over the country. Begin in a moment. Okay. I'm going to start in just a moment. Still coming in. Admit. Okay, we're going to begin. Welcome, everybody. And I'm going to introduce Nomi, and then I'll go back to admitting people. So Naomi Stoltzenberg is a legal scholar whose research spans a range of interdisciplinary interests, including law, religion, law and liberalism, law and feminism, psychoanalysis, and literature. She's been on the faculty of the USC Gould School of Law since 1988, after graduating from Harvard Law School and clerking for the Honorable John Gibbons, Chief Judge of the Third Circuit Court of Appeals. A strong proponent of multidisciplinary research and teaching, she helped establish the USC Center for Law, History, and Culture. And a number of my favorite students have been majors in that program, I'll just add. She's written numerous articles on law and religion and is currently developing a new theory of faith-based discrimination. Her book, American Shtetl, The Making of Kiryas Joel, a Hasidic village in upstate New York, co-authored with David Myers, will be published by Princeton University Press this January. And we've asked her to speak to us today about her research. So Nomi, take it away.
Great, I'm happy to do so. It's so nice to see everyone, although I can't see you all that well all at once. I want to thank Bruce and also Diane Winston for inviting me to talk about my research on the Satmar community, which, as many of you know, is the subject of my forthcoming book, which, with any luck, will overcome the supply chain problems and hopefully American Shtetl, The Making of Kiryas Joel, a Hasidic village in upstate New York, which I co-authored with my husband, Jewish historian David Myers, will be available for purchase by January. So we'll see. The book tells the story of the creation of the village of Kiryas Joel, which is a legally recognized municipality in upstate New York, which was founded by and still remains almost entirely populated by adherents of the Satmar branch of Hasidic Judaism. As some of you know, Hasidism itself is a branch of the wider phenomenon of strictly observant Jews known as Haredim. The term Haredim comes from the Hebrew word for those who tremble, which is drawn from the biblical verse, "Hear the word of the Lord, you who tremble at his word." Haredim, self-named, trembled at what they saw as the contaminating and corrosive effects of modernity and modern secular culture, and set about to resist them. Among the fiercest of Haredi leaders was Rabbi Joel, or in Yiddish, Joel or Joel, Teitelbaum, the founder of the Satmar Hasidic dynasty, after whom Kiryas Joel, which in Yiddish means village of Joel, was named. So Joel, or Reb Joelish, as he was known, came from the great incubator of Haredi Jewish culture, which is to say the northeast quadrant of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in Transylvania. He was a descendant of a distinguished line of Hasidic rabbis who were notable for their zealous commitment to doing battle to preserve the integrity of Torah, true Judaism. In 1946, after surviving the Holocaust, he brought his brand of Judaism and a very small band of followers amongst the few who survived the Holocaust to New York, where he settled in Williamsburg in Brooklyn, which at that time was just beginning to emerge as a major center of Haredi or ultra-Orthodox life. Although the city had the infrastructure and the density to support the reconstruction of the Satmar Hasidic world, which had been destroyed in the Holocaust, it also had seductions that Teitelbaum regarded as grave dangers. So starting as early as the late 1940s, he instructed his aides to find a place outside of the city that could serve as an enclave, where his followers could settle and live in spiritual purity, separated from the outside world. He described this vision as the recreation of the shtetl, a shtetl that would be made up entirely of his followers, although it bears mention that never before, and certainly not in Europe, had shtetls ever been composed of such a homogeneous population. To the contrary, the European shtetls were highly heterogeneous communities in which Jews lived side by side with Gentiles. In very few shtetls did Jews constitute or even begin to approach being the majority of the local population, let alone the totality. And in many, particularly the larger ones, the Jewish population was internally diverse as well, with people adhering to many different varieties of Judaism or Jewish identity. So the central argument of our book is that the Satmar shtetl of Kiryas Joel, characterized by its extreme religious homogeneity, as well as by an unprecedented degree of political empowerment. We've really never seen such a degree of political empowerment achieved by a Jewish community in modern times, bracket the state of Israel, is a decidedly American phenomenon that represents the convergence of the Satmar Rebbe's vision, his quest for a spiritually pure enclave, with the various forces of American law that support and foster residential segregation. Now, it took decades for the Satmar Rebbe's vision of an American shtetl to be concretely realized. Several early attempts to acquire land where his followers could settle were thwarted when residents of the communities that were targeted for land acquisition actively opposed the establishment of such a Jewish enclave in their midst. But in 1972, using purchasing agents who disguised the true purchaser's identity as Orthodox Jews, Teitelbaum's aides were finally able to acquire property in Orange County, New York, in the town of Monroe, which is just about an hour outside of New York City. And soon thereafter, real estate developers acting on behalf of the community rapidly built garden apartments, densely concentrated single-family homes for what was then expected to be an initial arrival of about 100 families. Now, at this point, the mid-1970s, according to most observers, most contemporaneous observers, the Rebbe did not imagine that this shtetl would be anything but a Haredi or ultra-Orthodox neighborhood within the existing town, not a self-standing village or town invested with its own legal and political authority by the state. But when the Satmar Hasidim began to move to Monroe, this was in 1974, they encountered, let's say, difficulties with their neighbors, including with Monroe town officials. Fast forward 2 years later, 1976, as zoning conflicts and a more generalized growing antagonism between the Satmars and Monroe officials intensified, and the prospect of legal action to resolve these controversies over zoning became ever more real, a deal was struck, allowing the Satmars to create an autonomous village within the town of Monroe. This would allow them to regulate zoning within the village and thus to build the kind of dense housing that they preferred and religious and business establishments, oftentimes tucked within residential housing, in accord with their distinctive way of life. It is thus that the Satmar shtetl became legally incorporated as a village, formerly known as the village of Kiryas Joel, which is a bit of a redundancy since Kiryas itself is the term for village in Yiddish, so it's the village of Joel. KJ, as it's familiarly known. Now, the story becomes far more complicated when the Rebbe dies less than 2 years after the incorporation of the village with no heir. From that point onward, there's been an ongoing succession crisis with two different factions vying for the title of heir to the Rebbe's throne. Now, this internal political conflict played itself out in, to me at least, mesmerizing, labyrinthine series of lawsuits, which we analyze at length in the book. But it was another lawsuit that first brought the community to wide public attention. And that was a suit that was instigated after the community succeeded, this is in 1990, in getting the New York State legislature to pass a special law enabling the village to establish its own school district, separated, in essence, seceding from the regional school district of which it was formerly a part. Now, that law, the passage of that law, resulted from a crisis pertaining to the education of children with special needs. In general, the Satmars couldn't be less interested in public schools. They send most of their children to private schools, which are indeed the chief point of pride of the community. These are schools that are established and run by the religious congregation under the intense supervision of the Rebbe. But in the mid-1970s, Congress passed what was then known as the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, since been redubbed the Individual with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA is the acronym. This is really one of the first major victories of the disability rights movement, which made the provision of publicly funded special education for children with special needs mandatory. And that created a need and a growing demand, and I have to say, kind of growing consciousness on the part of Satmar parents of disability rights and demand for those services. It also created a serious dilemma that pertained not just to the Satmars, but to all of the religious communities that depend on religious schools, as well as for the courts and policymakers who have had to decide, since the passage of this law, whether it is constitutional to provide publicly funded special education services, the services whose delivery is mandated by the law, to children who attend parochial schools. Now, that turns out to be an exceedingly difficult constitutional issue, which the Supreme Court has flip-flopped on. In 1997, the court decided, and this remains the law of the land today, that it is permissible to provide publicly funded educational services such as remedial education, special education, various therapeutic services to children in private religious schools. But that represented a reversal of the Supreme Court's decision 12 years earlier in 1985, less than a decade after Kiryas Joel was created. That 1985 decision held that providing state-funded educational services to children in private religious schools constituted a violation of the Establishment Clause and the principle of separation between religion and state, which it was said to embody. It was that 1985 decision that precipitated the crisis that led to the passage of the special law authorizing the creation of a separate school district in Kiryas Joel. And then that law was then itself challenged as constituting a violation of the Establishment Clause in a case that wound its way all the way up to the Supreme Court in 1994. 1994. That was quite a while ago. It was then, more than a quarter century ago, that I, along with others in the field of law and religion and First Amendment law, first began to write about Kiryas Joel. And I initially thought I'd write one, maybe two articles about the Supreme Court case and be done with it. But the thesis that I put forth in those initial articles was precisely that the constitutional issues pertaining to the village's public municipal institutions, the village, the public school district, were essentially epiphenomenal. That all of the real work that goes into shaping the community, defining its boundaries, enabling it to take rise as a self-segregated, highly homogeneous religious community within which religious law is strictly enforced and from which outside elements are excluded, that work is done by American private law. The law of the market, the law of the family, and the law of religion, which is conceptualized in American law as a private religious association, notwithstanding the fact that from the internal point of view of the community, the so-called private religious authorities are the ultimate public authorities, the ultimate legal authority. And further, under the rules of the American political system, the basic rules of local government and local democracy, such so-called private religious associations, through the exercise of the franchise, can readily transform themselves into public municipal entities, like the establishment of the village of Kiryas Joel. I call this phenomenon communitarianism from the bottom up, and having identified the need to focus on the bottom-up processes by which Kiryas Joel was formed and empowered, I couldn't resist the call to investigate them further, especially since I had the perfect partner urging me on and eager to join me in that endeavor. So I could go on and on about what ended up in the book that we wrote together. And lucky for me, and it's really my privilege and honor, I will get to do just that when David and I will have the honor of delivering the Niemer lecture at USC. So today, in the remainder of my time, I actually want to talk about things that didn't make it into the book. Three in particular. One is the divorce and custody litigation, the so-called spiritual custody disputes.
You think I'm a joke? Yeah. to say that.
Two is what was much in the news last year, the response of the community to the pandemic. And three are the signs of growing support for Trump and Trumpism, which seem to us to represent a radical change in political attitudes. So let me take those each in turn. I'll only address them briefly, so there's time for you all to ask questions. And I just want to say at the outset, personally, as interesting as each of those phenomena is in their own right, I'm also very interested in and wrestled a lot with the reasons why these really fascinating and important phenomena didn't make it into the book. So let me start with so-called spiritual custody disputes. That's a pretty interesting and evocative term that is used by courts, part of judicial discourse, to refer to disputes, custody disputes that arise when divorced parents disagree over the religious upbringing of their children. As it's played out in the Satmar community in particular, these are disputes that arise when one of the divorced parents defects from the community, and then the other parent goes to court seeking to require the defecting parent to essentially continue to raise their children in the Satmar way. So spiritual custody is the term that's used to refer to judicial decisions that award to one parent in these kinds of disputes the exclusive right to determine how the child will be raised religiously, overriding the wishes of the other parent. I found the occurrence of these cases, and there seem to be quite a number of them, absolutely fascinating for a number of reasons. One is it really challenges one of the key propositions, and you might say justifications, that are made of allowing communities like Kiryas Joel to exist. The proposition being, well, these are voluntary associations. They are voluntary private associations from which every member is free to exit. So one serious question is, how free are members of the community to exit, and what are the barriers to exit? Ample anecdotal evidence, as it were, suggests that one of the major barriers to exit is the fear of losing custody of their children. This is a community in which people are married, it's an arranged marriage, at a young age, and typically there's a fair amount of divorce. The typical divorcing couple is fairly young, oftentimes already has numerous children, and the specter of losing one's child seems to be a very real deterrent. First of all, to getting divorced, and second of all, to leaving the community. On the other hand, people do get divorced, and furthermore, people do leave the community. So something more complex than free exit and no exit is going on. What I am eager to understand more, and did not feel like I was able to investigate to my satisfaction, is what is the role being played by American law and by American courts, and in particular by family courts that determine these custody disputes, in either raising or lowering that barrier. And as I say, there's a lot of really interesting, I would say more than anecdotal evidence. And certainly in the course of my research, I was able to talk to lawyers who represent um, parties to divorces. I was able to talk to people who've been through these spiritual custody decisions. And one of the most interesting things of all, there are organizations that have developed, founded by defectors from the community, seeking to provide support and resources to others who are following their path of exit out of the community. But it's very, very difficult to find out how common various practices are. So I had the opportunity to speak to people and hear about their experiences. People in the community of exiters assert that it is very common, if not a universal practice, for courts to make these awards of so-called spiritual custody to the parent that has stayed inside the community, with really harrowing consequences for the parent that has moved away, oftentimes hasn't moved physically away, but is seeking to change their lifestyle. But there are many barriers to determining the validity of the assertion that this is a common practice. First of all, most custody decisions, they're private settlements, they're no public records. Furthermore, cases involving children, the records are sealed. So there's really no way of determining whether the stories I heard about what judges commonly do, how generalizable those experiences are. And that was one reason why, as much as I really wanted to share the really fascinating and moving narratives that I gathered about this area of law, I hesitated to put that material into the book. Dave and I both hesitated to, because of the absence of the kind of data and evidence that would permit us to generalize. So I remain really intrigued by that area of law. I think it tells us something potentially extremely important about the role that is being played by American courts, which certainly in some cases appear to be not only preferring the parent who stays within the community, but in effect to be certifying and putting the imprimatur of the American secular courts on what are settlements that have been authored by the rabbis. So in effect, one might argue the family courts are effectuating and really in a very powerful way enforcing, as it were, rabbinic decrees. That's a hypothesis that I can't substantiate. If I could be reincarnated, if I could replicate myself, if I could be another Naomi Stoltzenberg who was a cultural anthropologist, ethnographer, I think what it would really require to really find out what's happening in these cases is to do the kind of long-term embedded participant observation, really spend time in New York accompanying lawyers who the basic circuit is first they accompany their clients to the rabbinical court that grants the get, which is the official Jewish writ of divorce, following which the parties are ushered separately into a sort of antechamber where they are presented with the settlement agreement that has been facilitated, if not written, by the religious leaders in the community. It is very common now, we hear anecdotally, for these settlement agreements to contain what's called a Hasidic upbringing agreement, nestled within sometimes hundreds or more pages of the divorce and custody agreement. Sometimes the Hasidic upbringing agreement is just a paragraph. It's very brief and general, affirming that both parties agree to give their children a Hasidic upbringing. And sometimes, I've seen these with my own eyes, the Hasidic upbringing agreement embedded in a divorce and custody settlement runs for pages and pages, item after item. The parents agree not to let the child play with any children who are not members of the community. The parents agree not just to keep kosher these particular brands, this particular hechsher, this particular weave thickness brand of tights is the only brand of tights that the girls will weave, and so on and so forth, so that later, when one of the divorced parents ceases to abide by these terms, the other parent, it seems, oftentimes under the pressure of rabbis in the community, not necessarily of their own initiative, goes to court, says, my ex-spouse is in violation of the agreement, and the courts, certainly in some cases, and we simply don't know in how many, enforce the agreement and say that if the defecting party doesn't change his or her behavior, they'll lose custody of their child, okay? Even though people involved in these disputes whom I've interviewed have said in many instances they really weren't even aware that these agreements were in the settlement at the time they signed them. So that's an extremely interesting, I could attach other adjectives, phenomenon that I felt I couldn't learn enough about and establish enough facts about to include in the book, but I share it with you. The next two phenomenon, and I'm going to make this quick, and I'm sure some of you read about it in the papers, are most likely interrelated. And that is the way in which the community responded to the pandemic, and more specifically to restrictive measures adopted with the goal of containing the pandemic, and the growing evidence of support for Trump, and I would say Trumpism in the community. I'm sure a lot of you, if not all of you, have read the horror stories, and certainly there was a lot of, some would say, demonization of not only the Satmar community, but the larger community of ultra-Orthodox Haredi Jews in New York in particular and elsewhere, who were depicted, not without any foundation, as resisting the COVID-related restrictions, resisting the closures of synagogues, resisting the closures of religious schools, resisting specific measures, and now more recently resisting vaccination mandates. I say that there is foundation for all of that, but one needs to be careful, and the fact of the matter is we still don't know, again, we don't know enough of the facts to know how widespread the resistance in the community was. In point of fact, in the earliest days, I'm talking about March 16th, March 17th, I think, maybe the day in between Governor Newsom imposed the first closures and restrictions on maybe March 15th, and Governor Cuomo waited those two literally fatal days before he did the same. And in between the leaders in Kiryas Joel, they imposed restrictions. So there's a fair amount of sensationalism and exaggeration in the depiction of the community as being entirely resistant. But this happened after we finished the research on our book. We finished the research on our book at the end of 2019. So these are developments. Am I surprised that things went as they did? Am I surprised that there was the resistance there was? Am I not surprised on the basis of what we learned and documented and did end up describing in the book? I'm not even sure how to answer that question, in part because we still don't fully know. What we do know for sure, although we do not know how widespread it is that certainly there are significant segments of the community that resisted their own leaders' orders to not attend shul or not attend school or whatever the order might be. More than that, and there has been some interesting sociological work that's already beginning to be done, not only on the Haredi communities in the United States, but in Israel as well. I commend the work of Netta Barak Cohen. We seem to see, again, not necessarily universally, not necessarily a majority of the community, but definitely in sizable portions of the community, a change in attitude, an attitude that I think can only fairly be described as defiance, a kind of defiance of the authority of the state. And that's not in our book, because we did not see that in our book. That is to say, we did not see that in the period of time, which was a long period of time, extending from the mid-40s up until the end of 2019. That's not what we saw. Similarly, and related to that, we see Trumpism. We see the incorporation of a whole set of political attitudes and behaviors and a joining together with Trumpists outside of the community. So literally, right, I'm sure I'm not the only one who was shocked by the images of members of this community, a minority to be sure, at the January 6th insurrection, right? Now, in our book, and I'll close with this, we spend a lot of time documenting what I would call a kind of instrumental alliance that was forged over the course of decades, particularly with regard to litigation and litigation strategies between the religious right, and by that I really mean the Christian right, the so-called new Christian right, led by the likes of Jay Sekulow. But that was an alliance, so one sees active support on the part of Christian legal advocacy organizations for the Satmars in their unending legal disputes. But it really, first of all, was initiated by the Christian right, who really looked to and oftentimes upheld Kiryas Joel as a model that they should emulate. The Jewish Benedict is that what's called? The Benedict Option, right? And the Satmars gladly accepted that help. Why not? But they never, on our watch, incorporated the worldview that motivated the particular interpretations of legal doctrine that the likes of Jay Sekulow and other leaders of Christian right, really the Christian legal movement, were developing. So maybe we missed it. Did we miss it? It's possible. I don't think so. And here I'll leave you with this last not so fun fact. In the 2016 election, the Kiryas Joel was fairly evenly split between support for Hillary Clinton and support for Donald Trump. a majority for Trump, something like maybe 55% to 40, 56, 44, or something like that. 2020, 99%. Something has changed. Something very dramatic has changed. It occurred, we think, after we wrapped up our research at the end of 2019. And people are just beginning to study it. So in fact, David has convened a Haredi research group, really bringing together people who have the skills and training that we lack, sociologists, empiricists, to really try to get to the bottom of this. These are the things that didn't make it into the book. So I'm happy to share them with you, and I'm happy to entertain any questions you have.
Thank you, Nomi. That was a real treat, and I love that you shared with us stuff that's not going to be in the book, and there's so much for thought. Okay, so stuff is showing me. So Bob Rasmussen has raised his hand. That popped up, and I guess depending on your computer, you can do it through reactions or participants, and I'll try and keep an eye. So go ahead, Bob.
Okay, well, thanks. First of all, congratulations on finishing this book. I'm thrilled that it's coming out. I can't wait to read it. And thanks for giving us this extra bit of it. I was fascinated by your first point, and I know you're a scholar of property, and I'm from contracts. And how much do you think something similar could occur simply via contract? Obviously, contract is coming on the back end after the GATT when they send the settle agreement. But do you think couples could contract beforehand to commit to raise their children in tradition, or is it necessary to have this property element, this community, to get that agreement going? So I'm just curious, in other words, could you see something similar outside of the community, or is it necessary that you have this community either in terms of property law or perhaps proximity to each other?
Yeah. Are you asking, first of all, thank you, Bob. Are you asking whether people in other communities could forge similar religious upbringing agreements? And so in the absence of such a community? Yeah, sure. And I suspect it is beginning to happen. And actually, I think there's big unaddressed questions about the enforceability of these kinds of contracts. In many different religious communities, there's been a movement towards premarital counseling and hashing out of agreements around precisely these issues, right? And that's a good idea, I think. But should those be enforceable? And really, at the root, and I think it really is a contract question, 100%. I see contract and private property as of a piece, as being sort of the, I think the legal regimes that protect the rights of private property and private contract making. When I talk about this as a phenomenon of communitarianism from the bottom up, that's precisely what I'm talking about. So whether we're talking about agreements that are forged, they could be prenuptial contracts, they can be postnuptial contracts, they can be, embedded in divorce and settlement agreements. Whether we're talking about a whole other area of litigation that I didn't talk about, but I mentioned briefly that this ongoing feud, this great schism within the community between who's the rightful heir to the throne, that, produced volumes and volumes of lawsuits, much of which pivoted around private arbitration, right? One party first goes to a rabbinical court seeking to settle this internal political dispute there. The other party refuses to submit to the jurisdiction. So then they bring an Article 75 proceeding seeking to compel the other party to submit. So here's another area where the American policy, right? Private arbitration, Reagan, contract's going to save us, ends up being really the pivot around which so much of the litigation in the community has revolved. So whether you're talking about real estate contracts, divorce settlements, private arbitration, contract is everywhere in this story.
Thank you. That's great.
Great. And then Hillary Shore is next. So I think I can see, if I go to gallery view, different hands go up. So go ahead, Hillary.
Naomi, it's just so wonderful and so amazing. I remember the very first talk you did at USC about this material, and it's been wonderful to see the project evolve, but it's also kind of shocking to see the way some of the things have evolved within the community. And there are some huge questions that I'm not going to ask, but if you want to talk about them, that would be great. I mean, just thinking about, you don't want to get melodramatic, but I think at the moment, we all find ourselves more than a little hysterical and prone to melodrama, but there is something terrifyingly collaborationist about the way this language has begun to walk hand in hand with a movement that is unbelievably anti-Semitic. And it reminds me, and this is something that our larger group might want to take up in the next few months, the pro-Vichy France Jewish candidate running in France. I mean, this moment when a Jewish politician is actually saying the French only killed the bad Jews. I mean, it's just a little scary to watch these alliances. The thing that kept running through my head as you were talking really was a version of Bob's question. The way this began is so entirely a public law question. It really was in your earliest interests about school buses and going back and forth with the legislature, and could be understood fairly rationally as a school system attempting to get more resources for its children moving through civil law and public law in that way. And to watch these debates move into private law more and more seems to me really fascinating. And it may be linked to my other question, but it really did strike me as you were talking that this shift from public to private and this willingness to engage the American judicial system in private disputes was a real sea change, and true for you on a whole new set of legal skills and areas of expertise. But I want to ask both versions of that question. What has it been like for you watching that shift in these years? And where do you think that impulse has come from? This need to draw on what used to be Caesar's law for internal questions.
Well, I think there's at least 3 different questions there. So the need to draw, thank you, Hillary. I mean, those are so rich. The drawing upon Caesar's law, whether it's to resolve these internal political disputes or to resolve disputes between divorced parents over the religious upbringing of their children, that, first of all, that is nothing new. There's always been this tension, but nonetheless the coexistence between 2, in some ways, very contradictory impulses that are characteristic of the Satmars, and I would say, well, maybe I shouldn't have the temerity to say all religious separatist communities, but maybe all, right? Which is the separatist impulse, right? The impulse, we're going to withdraw into a realm that's separated from the world in which we will be ruled by religious law and not secular law, right? That seems to be an eschewal, a repudiation of the law of Caesar. But that impulse has always coexisted, going back to Europe, right? I mean, this is definitive of all of the Haredi communities with for lack of a better term, an accommodationist impulse, which was always justified with reference to the Jewish analog, the halachic analog of render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, which is dina di machuta dina, the law of the state, is the law of the land. And so long as the secular authorities and secular law was being appealed to in service of sort of maximizing the ability of the community to withdraw, it was deemed to be legitimate, but it had to be performed not by the rabbis themselves. And it went hand in hand with the political attitude that I do believe existed and was prevalent until very recently, I think, until the Trump years, which was absolutely not defiance of the authority of the state, but a kind of reverence for the state and appreciation of the state, which was easy to do because the state was very accommodating of it. We're not going to enforce our education laws too strictly. We're not going to get into we're going to let them do their thing. So the state's accommodation of this community enabled the community to be accommodating of the state and respectful. It had an attitude of respect for the state and respect for the law of the state that I think existed up until a couple of years ago. And so I do find it shocking and immensely disturbing, although as I look back, I mean, I'm now happy that I spent so much time. Sometimes this thing is this, and why am I spending so much time documenting, sort of the rise of the Christian right and how it was changing the law of the First Amendment, but also American political culture and the rise of libertarianism. These things seemed kind of peripheral. It was the context in which the Satmars were sort of bobbing along and doing pretty well in the law, notwithstanding and they sort of benefited from the rising libertarianism and promotion of private arbitration and promotion of private this and private that. And that brings me to your final point with, it's not public law or private law. Really, I think what is definitive of this era, right, at least from the Reagan era onward, but maybe it begins before, is really the development and expansion of hybrid, right? Quasi-public, quasi-private, hybrid, right? That's epitomized by something like private arbitration, right? That is, and proponents of it will describe it as libertarian, but of course that's a kind of bogus characterization because it's permitted and enabled and furthered. It's a legal policy to promote. And at the end of the day, it's overseen by the state, right? So that kind of hybrid situation, the Satmars very much benefited from that new form of American governance, as some have called. I could talk to you about the public school buses, which is very interesting, but I'll see if somebody else wants to get a word in. And if not, I'll be happy to talk about the public school buses.
Yeah, talk about the public school buses. I'd be interested.
Okay, so Hillary alluded to yet another legal controversy that I didn't mention. And I should say, there's so many ironies here. So one irony is, okay, on the one hand, there's the halachic principle, the principle of Jewish law, essentially render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, respect the law of the state, but, kind of minimize its incursions and maximize the private sphere. There's another halachic principle, which is you don't bring your internal disputes to Gentile courts. Well, never has a principle been more honored in the breach, right? I mean, there is just the degree to which one party or another to an internal political dispute has resorted to the Gentile courts is just flabbergasting. I mean, part of the reason it took me so long to work on there's so many lawsuits, and they all have the same name, but it turns out they're different, and it's crazy. So then you say, well, why did they do that? And at a certain point, as I sought to answer that, was it just a happenstance? Basically, ultimately, the question I found myself asking was, could it be otherwise, right? Is this just a purely kind of historically contingent phenomenon for one reason or another, for one set of interests or another? The parties who happened to be on the ground in that particular point in time, they decided to go to the Gentile courts, thereby invoking the power of the state and using it to determine the allocation of property, the allocation of custody, the allocation of power and control over the religious institutions, the schools, and the public institutions, over housing in the community. Could it have been otherwise, right? Was that just a happenstance? And suddenly I find that I'm like, oh my God, this is basically like HLA Hart, legal positivism versus natural law. Because at the end of the day, I found myself gravitating to the position that there is something fundamental to the human, something inescapable in the human condition, in the human situation, which necessitates resort to some external authority. Maybe call it a state or don't call it a state, but isn't that really ultimately at bottom what the state is? And what is it? Was it, I think it was an unavoidable circumstance, I think, right? But now I'm just talking like an old-fashioned natural law person. I'm making a claim about human nature. I think it was I do not think it was within the realm of possibility, given the nature of human conditions and human societies, that this kind of dispute wouldn't develop sooner or later, right? It was postponed. That moment of internal political conflict was sort of suspended, maybe by the charisma of the original Rebbe's personality, maybe by the trauma of survival, and when over 90% of the community did not survive the Holocaust. That lasted a nanosecond, and I'm tempted to say it could only last a nanosecond. Eventually conflicts, and then what happened with the private arbitration dispute, I would say, is inevitable. Of course, that party says, well, that tribunal, that rabbinical court is biased against us. We'll only agree to arbitrate it with that rabbinical court. And then they say, well, there's no choice. You need, right? It's just Hobbes. It's just all of a sudden you're doing social contract 101. So I think that's inescapable. But wasn't I supposed to be talking about the school buses, I think? The school bus controversy actually preceded the special education crisis, which led to the subsequent school district litigation. And that actually, it wasn't about resources, it was about gender segregation. So one thing that I learned, something I was fairly ignorant of, and I think this ignorance is widely shared, is that school districts do a lot more than operate public schools, and they serve a much broader constituency than enrollees in public schools. School districts have legal responsibilities, legally mandated responsibilities, to provide a host of services to every single child in the district, regardless of whether they attend public school, private school, they're homeschooled, they're in juvenile detention, it doesn't matter. That includes remedial education services, Title I services, it includes special education services, and depending upon the state, in states that have legislated it includes providing school bus transportation to all children to attend whatever school they happen to go to, whether it's private or public, whether it's religious or secular. This is the issue, the constitutionality of such laws that many states passed, certainly including the state of New York, which was largely in response to the growing influence of the Catholic population and the parochial school community. This is the very, very first modern Establishment Clause case. In 1947, Everson, people went to court and said, it's unconstitutional. It's a violation of the Establishment Clause. It's a violation of the principle of separation of church and state for the state to provide this publicly funded service, school bus transportation, to religious schools. And in a very schizophrenic decision, the Supreme Court rejected that claim. So in the very same decision, this is the decision in which the Supreme Court really, for the first time, I mean, Reynolds versus United States, late 19th century case involving the Mormons, that's the first case where the court invoked Jefferson's wall of separation metaphor, but it's really not until 1947. This case does a number of notable things. Number one, it's the first case in which the Establishment Clause is incorporated through the 14th Amendment, deemed to apply to states, right? By its terms, it's only Congress that's forbidden from enacting a law respecting an establishment of religion. It's the first case that really says the Establishment Clause embodies the principle of separation between church and state, and that's the principle we're going to use to resolve all questions about the Constitution. And nonetheless, although the court says, oh, this program, it sort of approaches the verge of, breaching the wall of separation, but we're going to uphold it. So ever since then, any state that has wanted to, seen New York State, seen many, many other states, has had laws mandating public school districts to provide school buses to ferry school children to private schools, including religious schools, as well as to public schools. So that before the Kiryas Joel School District was created, and before the whole controversy arose that went up to the Supreme Court, from the early days of its creation in 1977, the village of Kiryas Joel is embedded in the town of Monroe, which is embedded in the regional Monroe-Woodbury School District. Woodbury is a neighboring town, so two towns. They have no interest in going to the public schools, but they're very interested in the school bus transportation. So, and it's all going along merrily enough. There's no controversy until every year the schedule of school bus drivers were assigned to different routes on the basis of seniority. And one year, for the first time, a female bus driver is assigned to the route that delivers the boys to the boys' schools, the yeshivas. All along, the school buses had been de facto gender segregated, but of course not legally, because the boys and girls went different places, so they needed buses going on different routes. When that happened, the rabbis organized a strike. They said, no. I mean, first they demanded a change. It wasn't conceded to. They organized a strike. And so then, accommodation, the school district said, okay, they didn't want trouble, and they reassigned the female school bus driver to a different route. Then she went to court. No, actually, first she went to arbitration. It went through the union, right? And the union eventually found in her favor, and then it's a long story. It was a gender discrimination issue. It was a gender discrimination suit, but it really presaged a lot of the issues. And as you say, that it's a really vivid example of the hybridity of public-private. You really can't draw a clean. Once states say public school districts are going to provide services to private schools, and once the Supreme Court says that's okay, there is no longer a bright line distinction between the public and the private domain, between public and private services, between public and private education. And I think that's an important part of the story that isn't so well understood. Likewise, the fact that school districts have an obligation to provide special education services to every child. School districts actually legally have the obligation to identify every child who has a special need, which is hard to do if they're not in the public schools. It's hard to do if they're homeschooled or in a parochial school, right? How can the state fulfill that obligation? How can the school district fulfill that obligation without means that intrude upon the private religious domain? So this is the dilemma I alluded to. But for those of you who followed the controversy over the so-called takeover of the school district, where was it, in Ramapo or Muncie, New York, which is a nearby community, but with some different characteristics, that had everything to do with this issue of how does a school district fulfill its obligations to students who aren't enrolled in the public schools.
And I'll have a question later, but first I'm going to defer to Sarah Ben-Or.
Hi. Wow, Nomi, I've just learned so much in the last hour. Thank you so much. This is great. My question is about collaboration or interaction between the Satmar group that you're studying, or Haredim in general, and Christian legal theorists or legal actors. And I was wondering, well, first of all, could you just tell us more about the Benedict option? Because I wasn't familiar with that. And do Satmar Jews use terminology like that come from the Christian world? Do they attend conferences about, I don't know, law and religious communities, or do they have any interaction that you know of? Yeah, so that's my question.
Yeah, thanks. It's such a great question, and it really speaks to one of my major interests, which is the role of the Christian right and the rise of the Christian right. And part of the reason I have been taken by surprise by the emergence of, by the adoption of really what we clearly now are seeing elements of the Satmar community that share the ideology of the Christian right. And that surprised me because I didn't see it, even though I was like, so it was, I don't want to say it was a one-way street, but what we saw pre-2019 was intense interest on the part of the Christian right in Kiryas Joel and in Haredi Jews generally, that wasn't really reciprocated. I mean, it was like, sure, you're supporting us, you're submitting amicus briefs and support, great. You're reshaping the doctrine in ways that are very congenial and have happy, like, great, to the extent they were, but the interest was kind of one way at the ideological level. The Benedict Option is a term, it's actually the title of the book, an immensely popular book that came out, I was just looking it up, by a man named Rod Dreher, who's really regarded as one of, if not the single most influential thought leaders of the Christian right. I'm trying to see when the book came out. I think it came out in 2017. He's an interesting guy. He's actually, I think he grew up in some kind of Protestant church. He subscribes to some branch of Eastern Orthodoxy. So that's another interesting development in the Christian right, is sort of the growing involvement of the Eastern Orthodox Church. I'm happily blanking on his name, but Health and Human Services, Azar. He's another example. And he was selected because of his Christian right bona fides and the fact that he was pro-life and pro-religious liberty, and that's who presided over our response to COVID. Those were his qualifications that way. So the Benedict Option is the title of a book that was written by this very popular writer in sort of the conservative and more specifically religious conservative blogosphere. But by that I mean including the likes of basically everyone who was running almost everything in the last administration, right? Barr and Pompeo and so on and so forth. And so in 2017, Dreher was saying basically to his fellow, the community, including evangelical Christians, conservative Catholics like integralists, and Eastern Orthodox who are along the ride, and maybe some Orthodox Jews who start, to answer your question. We've gone too far with this Falwell program, which was, Falwell back in the day came along and said, we've gone too far in withdrawing from mainstream society and eschewing involvement in politics. We've got to get involved with politics, right? Moral majority and so on and so forth. By 2017, the likes of Rod Dreher are saying, we've gone too far. It's classic religious separatist rhetoric. It's inherently corrupting. Trump is terrible. He was a critic of Trump. It's dirty. We don't want to. We need to withdraw. We need to do what Benedict did, which is, he withdrew into his monastery, right? We need to return to the path of separatism. We need to, and if I recall correctly, and it's a popular book. It's an easy read. You'll be interested in reading it, Sarah. And I think he has a chapter about Kiryas Joel, or, let's do what they did, right? Now, fast forward a few years, and now Dreher is saying, well, I didn't really mean retreat. And, and before the last election, he said, Trump is completely odious, but, the usual line, God works in mysterious ways, strange vessels, blah, blah, blah. You gotta vote for him, because he will protect our right to separate ourselves. So you have all of that going along, and you have this growing Christian fascination with, let's call it Hasidic separatism or Haredi separatism. And as far as I can tell, the Haredim and the Satmars in particular, as I said before, they're not paying that much attention to it. Like any support, sure. It was, from time, there were, in situations where there were convergent interests, great. So the original convergent interest is public funding for religious schools. That was it. That's the bit, why were organizations like Culpa founded? Because, it'll be a little reductionist, but, that was the original agenda item of the Christian right, that's what I think first began to attract not only the ultra-Orthodox, but Orthodox Jews. But it was really just a marriage of convenience. It was around a very limited interest. It didn't extend beyond that. Now, I think and I don't think there was much engagement in, interaction with the thought of Christian right leaders. Rather, what you had, and a really interesting part of the story, is the role of lawyers, and in particular Jewish lawyers, not only, but of every different religious and political ideological stripe. So it was really Nathan Lewin, Nat Lewin. Some of you will know him. He's one of the foremost, he's a preeminent lawyer, constitutional lawyer, an Orthodox Jew. He really sort of epitomized modern Orthodoxy, right? He was sort of the quintessential product of modern Orthodoxy. He's not at all a Haredi Jew, and he goes to Harvard Law School, and he's buddies and best friends with Scalia. And he's the lawyer. He's the man you go to. He's the lawyer that the Satmars turned to when the challenge to the constitutionality of the public school district went to the Supreme Court. I interviewed Lewin. I mean, I interviewed a lot of these characters and these lawyers. These guys, they play such fascinating roles as cultural translators. And there's a lot of interesting questions about language, Sarah, and how certain legal terms then become part of sort of Satmar popular parlance and vice versa. And, who knows people's accounts of themselves and their motivations. I mean, certainly the story that Lewin himself tells is similarly, I'm advancing our agendas. I'm advancing the agendas of the Orthodox community, which, as I said before, are chiefly to secure public support for religious education. And then, there were a few other things that came up. The Carey case, right? The census counting case. And there were other cases, and it's almost always Nat Lewin who takes them on. There's racial dimensions to this that get pretty dicey. But it's really not, for a long time, they're not signing up for the rest of the program. Like, give us publicly funded schools, and, maybe we'll participate in some, I don't know, racial districting stuff. But we're not signing up for, pro-life, and we're not signing up for fascism and and something has happened. Something has happened. Now, there is, the pre-pandemic anti-vax movement, I think, is probably an important part of the story. It's kind of a carrier, right? We're asking a question, where do these ideas come from, right? Where do these ideological changes come from? Ideas are like viruses. They spread. What was their, I suspect, you did see, and again, these were importations, right? There's nothing indigenous about anti-vax beliefs in Jewish culture, and yet it was already a visible feature of some elements of these communities prior to the pandemic. There is nothing indigenous about the ideological beliefs and assertions that are now being, dare I say, trumpeted by elements of the community. The irony is that this signing on to the Christian rights, Benedict Option, libertarian, anti-state ideology is the ultimate form of assimilation into an alien American Christian culture. This is the Christianization of the Satmars, I think.
That's a great lead into my question. Because I just want to say that when I was doing my dissertation well into the previous century, the Bostoner Rebbe was already working with the Catholic Church to get state funds for parochial schools. So yeah, I definitely understand that. What I'm wondering about sort of the convergence between sort of the ultra-Orthodox and the Christian right is that essentially the Haredi have they yearn for pre-modern Europe. So in the sense, the good old days for them was when we had a Christian country and we had Jewish autonomy and, Jews were separate but self-governing. And there was just, I think it was APPI or somebody just had a recent poll where some huge percentage of evangelicals would like it to be a Christian country. And I'm wondering if your sense of like the people you were studying, if they wouldn't kind of embrace that as long as they could carve it out as like a Judeo-Christian country. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And be basically self-governing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, I don't know. That's why I think it's really important that this new research is being conducted, because we haven't seen statements of beliefs to that effect. But I think it's entirely plausible and possible. I absolutely do. Now, there is one further irony. There's one problem, one sticking point. Like, I think those elements of the Satmar and wider Haredi culture that would be receptive to that kind of system for the reasons you suggested, they would not necessarily have a problem with, you know, the far right Christian agenda of like basically, Diane, I'm sure you would have a lot to say about this, you know, sort of affirming that America is a Christian nation and returning Christianity to the public realm and so on and so forth. What they might have a problem with is the Christian Zionism, because this is a community that is rabidly anti-Zionist. You know, that's the other, I mean, there's like irony upon irony here. And one of the ironies is, you know, it may be less of a, you know, from their own internal point of view, there may be no contradiction in standing side by side with Christian nationalists. But standing side by side with Christian Zionists, that's a problem. But, you know, if it doesn't really get in their way, they've put, I mean, politicians have been showing up, right, at banquets and like, you know, making the gaffe of like playing Hatikva for decades. So that they're used to it. They probably just kind of laugh at it, like, haha, isn't that funny that they would think we're Zionists? Probably, I guess, not too big of a sticking point.
Great. So I don't see any more questions. Nomi, I want to thank you so much. This was really fascinating. Particularly, you gave us sort of the insider look at what do they call it in film? The outtakes.
Yeah, yeah, they were the outtakes. Yeah,
and Nomi, could you tell us when your Niemer lecture is, just since everybody's on, if you could.
Sarah, do you remember what so, you know, it's another pandemic casualty, so we keep rescheduling it. Do you remember?
I'm not sure of the exact date yet.
Yeah, well, anyway, I think it'll be in the fall.
It'll be October or November.
Oh, thanks, Steve.
And if you want to make sure you don't lose it, you can just go Google USC Kasdan Research Faculty Graduate Student Research Seminars, and you'll get on the mailing list for the Kasdan Center at USC for all these wonderful programs, including Nomi's, which I'm very much looking forward to.
Well, thank you all for such great questions. I enjoy talking about all this, so.
It's really wonderful, Nomi. It's wonderful.
Nomi, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nomi. And thank you all for joining us. It was quite an interesting group today. You clearly have a lot of fans.
She's our hero.
Well,
we adore her.
Aw, hi, Hillary. It's nice to see you.
So great. It is amazing having watched, it's not just that the project evolves, but the thing that you're studying, the object of investigation.
Yes.
I mean, I remember it was less than 10 years ago when you said suddenly, you know, I decided I should go back and reread this original case. And the next thing you knew, you were all following, you know, transcript after transcript. So as an intellectual project,
well, the other, you know,
it evolved as the field of study and bringing David into it. And then the community has changed in such fascinating and unexpected and often really depressing ways, you know. But there's also, I would have asked if we'd had longer, there is also this strong public interest now in the Orthodox, and a really, you know, there was a show about people who leave the community. There's Gisel, but there's also an active feminist voice within that community that has evolved over the years that you've been working on it.
And I think even have a rock
really
group.
interesting too.
They have called Bulletproof Stockings. It's an all-female Hasidic rock group.
Yeah.
And then there's David's fascinating project, which I'm sort of tangentially part of, because I actually don't research that. The Haredi research.
No, I mean, there's so much more to learn. Yeah.
But it actually brought together all these different people researching. We have a demographer in England, and we have people who are doing ethnographies in Brooklyn. Just a real interesting variety of people.
Yeah.
So Nomi, I was thinking, I should bring this up with Steve, but there was this article by Daniel Elazar, like at least 50 or 60 years ago, called The Legal Status of American Jewry, where he just reviewed every case that involved American Jews. Like, like American Jews don't exist as a legal entity because of separation of church and state. So how do Jewish issues get handled? So like kashrut is, truth in advertising. And so we don't recognize any, kosher authority as definitive, but nonetheless, if you're saying something's kosher, there's some lines like if you bought it from Ralph's, it's not kosher. So I'm wondering, is this, so maybe that would be a topic for a new Kasdan annual, because to really revisit that, because it sounds like some of those things are starting to change, right?
Yeah, I didn't know of that article. I'd really like to, I'd like to see it. Yeah.
I'll see if I can track it down. I know it was in, I think it was in the American Jewish Yearbook. So let me, I used to assign it. I'm sure I have a Xerox of it somewhere, but I will track it down.
This would actually be a really interesting, maybe a one-day event for CLHC and Kasdan to do together. Because I think that question of law within law is interesting to so many people, but that question, this is like being of a certain age. I remember my father had a book of short stories. My father was a high school English teacher, called American Jewish Fiction. And it was, as Nomi is fond of saying, at the roots moment, when suddenly there was this field, which was, and at first we were all appalled because we all wanted to be Americans, and then you identify a separate voice. And so all those questions of assimilation and the way what everyone wants really is self-determination. I want to be a Jew when I want to be, and an American when I want to be. And I think that's what Nomi is saying. It's a sort of version of something I've been thinking about a lot in my own work of forum shopping, right? Because that's some of what you're describing, Nomi, right? Like, this court didn't give me what I wanted, so I'm going to go find another court.
Oh God, that's part of the reason there's so many lawsuits.
Yeah.
They file a lawsuit, they decide, they believe that either that a judge is biased against them, or he's not going to give them what they want, or she's not going to give them what they want. A lot of this has to do, when I was going back and rereading the cases, it was, now we hear the term shadow docket all the time. I don't think that term had been coined yet, but basically, because I had just been reading like final decisions, and oftentimes the final decision will be, we can't decide this. This is an internal religious debate. We're not going to get involved. It's like the political question doctrine. It's like the court. But then you go back and you realize, oh my God, like 3 years ago, there was because it's just like what's going on now. A lawsuit is filed. It takes time for a lawsuit for a legal proceeding to be conducted. So then the next thing that happens is, let's say it's the two sides arguing over who's the real president of the congregation, right? And we're bringing a lawsuit to compel the other side to submit to arbitration by the rabbinical court. But meanwhile, who's going to run the synagogue? Who's going to pay the bills, right? Your Honor, you have to, we are making, here's a petition, this is an emergency appeal, a pretrial order. You have to decide, pending the outcome of the litigation, who gets to run the show. And it turns out that all these cases that seemingly issued in no decision, in a decision not to decide, were cases in which the most fateful decisions were made on the shadow docket, where the court said, okay, we're going to give them the keys to the office, and they have exclusive access to the checkbook. Well, now they've created facts on the ground so that 3 years later, when the court says, we can't get involved, so therefore we're not going to intervene and the status quo will be the status quo, so that was it took me a long time, right, as a kind of egghead armchair legal theory type of scholar who didn't, I just read like opinions. Well, opinions, like that's the end. So much of the really decisive action is occurring on what we would now call the shadow docket, where these sort of emergence, what are we going to do in the meanwhile, right? Those things are really, really decisive.
That's where the sausage is made.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that's, I think another example of this hybrid phenomenon. So, is the law playing any role in determining, the law says we're just not going to get involved. So whatever the facts on the ground, meaning whatever the de facto power relations are, that's to say private, we're not going to do anything to destabilize the existing power relations, right? Has the court in that instance actually not done anything to determine the existing, or has it? Well, there isn't really a simple answer to that question. I think it is very much, so at one level, the court is simply deferring to the realm of private ordering, and like, however things get sorted out there, and whoever, we'll let private power determine the shape of private relations for itself, and the state's not going to intervene. But we are going to tell the folks who we think currently have the upper hand that they have the keys to the castle. So then it doesn't look so strictly private anymore, right? So there's a lot of that. A lot of that.
I'm going to end the meeting now because I have to get to another one.
Yeah, we're done.
Nomi, again, thank you so much.
Thank you,
Nomi. Love you.
Bye. Bye, everybody. Bye, Don.